Can we truly cultivate peace within our bodies while living in systems that continually communicate fear? Let's explore where America's peace flag has gone. Welcome back, everyone, to the Yin-care Podcast. I'm your host, Margaret Jacobson, the Mother Rising, and I'm so happy to have you here today. As many of you know, this podcast is ultimately about sovereignty, about your choice, and not sovereignty as an abstract political concept, right? But sovereignty is a lived experience. The experience of feeling safe enough in your own body to hear your own inner knowing. The experience of trusting yourself enough to make choices aligned with your values. And the experience of reclaiming your authority in areas where you've been taught to hand it away. Much of our conversation together has focused on health, medical decision-making, birth, motherhood, living in a woman's body, and making decisions anchored in your own womb wisdom. And fear can disconnect us from our deepest wisdom. And while those conversations are incredibly important, today I'd like to really widen the lens because there's something that I've come to understand over the years. It is very difficult to feel truly safe inside your body and have the courage to make new choices if you do not also feel safe in the world around you. Our bodies are always listening. They're listening not only to our thoughts and emotions, but to our environments, to our families, to our communities, to our institutions, to the systems that shape our daily lives. A woman can spend years healing her nervous system while still carrying a quiet, unspoken feeling that something about the larger world doesn't quite make sense, that something feels off, that there are questions she has never been encouraged to ask. And so today, I want to invite you into a different kind of conversation, a conversation about symbols, about history, and about peace, and about the environment in which we are attempting to live, heal, raise families, and create our peaceful communities and lives at large. The episode you are about to hear was originally created for the Wyoming on the Land podcast, a new podcast I am hosting as the coordinator for the Wyoming Assembly, as part of America's upcoming 250th birthday celebration. At first glance, it appears to be a conversation about flags. But as I sat with this material, I realized it is really a conversation about something much deeper. It's a conversation about the difference between war and peace. And in our overall conversation for the Yin-care Podcast, really looking at what war and peace are in our bodies is really important. The difference between governed and governing ourselves as well. The difference between living in a culture organized around fear and conflict versus one organized around trust, participation, and peace. Whether you ultimately agree with every conclusion presented isn't really the point. What matters is the willingness to ask questions, just as we've been asking about the Western medical industrial complex system. And to become curious, because the ability to question stems from our ability to generate curiosity. And to notice as you're listening to this, what happens in your body. Observe what you feel resonant with and where you feel resonance and where you feel resistance. Because curiosity itself is truly a sovereign act. The moment we become willing to ask questions we were never taught to ask, something begins to open. So I invite you to settle in, perhaps with a cup of tea, perhaps with a journal nearby, Take a deep breath. Feel your feet on the ground and listen not only with your mind, but with your whole body. Because today we're exploring a fascinating question. If peace was declared on the land in America, where did the peace flag go? Enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone. Welcome into the Wyoming on the Land podcast, a new periodic podcast, not only for those who have reclaimed their political status on the land and soil of Wyoming, but for those who are curious about what it might mean. As America approaches the celebration of her 250th birthday, millions of Americans will proudly be displaying Old Glory. And rightly so. The Stars and Stripes has accompanied our nation through triumph and tragedy, through sacrifice and perseverance, through some of the greatest moments in our history. There will be fireworks not only across the states, but a spectacular display in our town of Lander, Wyoming, at the base of the Wind River Mountain Range, from dusk through to the midnight hour. There will be parades, there will be speeches, there will be flags. But what if I told you that the flag most Americans know is actually America's wartime flag? And what if I told you that America has another flag, a flag specifically associated with peace? A flag that once flew over customs houses, post offices, federal courts, and other civilian institutions, a flag that most Americans have never seen, a flag that almost disappeared from the public memory. As we celebrate 250 years of American independence, perhaps this is the perfect time to ask a simple question. Why do we know so much about our wartime flag and so little about our peacetime flag? And once we begin asking that question, we discover that it leads us to an entirely different conversation, a conversation about war and peace, about civilian government and military administration, about American history, and perhaps most importantly, about what happened to the peace that was declared on this land after the civil mercenary conflict between the states. Tonight, we're going to explore America's forgotten peace flag and ask a question that very few Americans have ever been encouraged to consider. If peace was declared, where did the peace flag go? Most Americans grew up believing there is only one American flag, the Stars and Stripes, Old Glory, the red, white, and blue, the flag that flew over battlefields, the flag carried by soldiers and sailors, the flag raised over military installations, the flag that accompanied our nation through war. What most Americans don't know is that throughout much of our history, there was another flag, a civilian flag, a peacetime flag, a flag distinguished by vertical stripes rather than horizontal ones. The symbolism is surprisingly simple. Horizontal bars have long represented resistance, restriction, defense, and protection. Think of a gate closing on a road. Think of a barricade. Think of a defensive line. Vertical columns, on the other hand, symbolize openness. The gates are open, and the vertical red lines are the living blood of the people standing upright on the land and soil, not toppled over and dead after a war. Commerce flows in a peacetime flag. People move freely. Government stands in its proper place. One flag represented a nation engaged at war. The other represented a nation at peace. When you stop to think about it, doesn't it seem natural? Wouldn't it make sense for a nation to have one symbol for military authority and another for civilian governance? one for conflict and one for peace, one for defending freedom and another for enjoying it? At this point, a reasonable person might ask, if this peace flag existed, where is the evidence? The answer is that evidence appears in several places. One of the most famous references comes from Nathaniel Hawthorne. Before writing the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne worked at a federal customs house. In the introduction to the Scarlet Letter, titled The Custom House, he describes the American flag flying above the building. Students of this history have long pointed out that this description corresponds to a flag with vertical stripes rather than horizontal ones. That reference appears in a publication from 1850, more than a decade before the civil mercenary conflict between the states that many refer to as the Civil War. But Hawthorne is not the only source. There are period illustrations, photographs, and lithographs, government buildings depicted with a vertically striped American flag flying at customs houses, post offices, polling locations, federal civilian facilities. Again and again, the same pattern appears. Military facilities displayed the war flag. Civilian facilities displayed the peace flag. Imagine for a moment that you're standing in front of a customs house in the 1850s. A ship has just come into port. Merchants are unloading cargo. Families are arriving from distant shores. Government clerks are conducting the ordinary business of a nation at peace. Above the building flies a flag with vertical stripes, not a symbol of conflict, not a symbol of military authority, a symbol of open gates, open commerce, open government, peace. That was the America our ancestors knew, or at least part of it. And then this brings us to the question, if the peace flag existed, what happened to it? Because today we only see one flag, the wartime flag, the stars and stripes at every federal building, at every courthouse, at every agency, at nearly every public event. The symbol that remains visible is the symbol of war. The symbol that disappeared is the symbol of peace. Why? Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, let's simply pause and think about this. If a nation were truly at peace, wouldn't it be natural to display the symbols of peace? Wouldn't civilian institutions be represented by civilian symbols? Wouldn't civilian government operate under civilian authority? Those seem like reasonable questions. And once you ask them, another question naturally follows. What happened after the conflict between the states that many refer to as the Civil War? What happened? What really did happen? As many of you already know from your own study of American history, President Andrew Johnson issued proclamations declaring peace on the land after the conflict between the states. The shooting war ended. The army stood down. Peace was declared. And doesn't that seem natural? Wouldn't peace declarations normally mark a return to peacetime administration? Wouldn't they signal a transition from wartime conditions back to ordinary civilian government? Wouldn't they suggest that peacetime symbols should once again become prominent? Yet something curious happened. The wartime flag remained, and over time, the peace flag gradually vanished from public memory. Most Americans alive today have never seen it. Most have never even heard of it, and most have no idea it has ever existed. And how does an entire nation forget one of its own symbols? That is a question worth considering. Let's ask a purely hypothetical question. If a country remained under some form of wartime administration for an extended period of time, what might that look like? Would executive authority become increasingly important? Would emergency powers become normalized? Would administrative agencies expand? Would civilian populations find themselves increasingly managed by centralized bureaucracies? Would regulations multiply? Would local authority gradually give way to distant authority? Would people begin interacting more often with agencies than with representatives? Would citizens become accustomed to being governed rather than being governed themselves? And would military necessity become the justification for extraordinary powers? Would temporary measures gradually become permanent institutions? These are not conclusions. These are questions worth asking, because one of the responsibilities of a free people is understanding the difference between peace and war, not simply on a battlefield, but in the structure of government itself. Now let's consider the other side of the equation. What would we expect if we saw a nation that was operating under peacetime conditions? Would government become more local than more centralized? Would communities exercise greater responsibility for their own affairs? Would its people be encouraged to participate directly in self-governance and government? Would civilian institutions stand clearly separate from military institutions? Would public offices be filled by neighbors known to the community rather than by distant administrators? And would laws become easier for ordinary people to understand? Would disputes be resolved closer to home? Would government focus less on control and more on service? Would peace itself become the normal condition rather than an interruption between conflicts? Would we see symbols of peace displayed as prominently as symbols of war? Would civilian buildings fly civilian flags? Would public servants remember who they are? Public servants. And would citizens remember that they are the source of authority? Again, these are not conclusions. They are questions. But sometimes asking the right questions helps us see things that have been hidden in plain sight. And perhaps that brings us back to the forgotten peace flag, because maybe the peace flag was never simply a piece of cloth. Maybe it represented an entirely different understanding of how a free people govern themselves. Maybe it represented a government that served the people rather than managed them. Maybe it represented a nation that expected peace to be the norm rather than war. And if that's true, perhaps recovering the history of the peace flag means recovering something much larger than a forgotten symbol. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: for generations, Americans have honored the symbols of war while scarcely remembering the symbols of peace. We know the stories of battlefields. We know the stories of military victories. We know the stories associated with Old Glory. But how many Americans know the story of the peace flag? How many have ever seen it? How many have ever asked why it disappeared? As we approach America's 250th birthday, perhaps there's no better time to rediscover forgotten pieces of our history, not to diminish Old Glory, not to diminish the sacrifices of those who served beneath it, but to remember that peace has a symbol too, a symbol that once represented a civilian government, a symbol that once flew over the everyday institutions of a nation at peace, a symbol that deserves to be remembered. As Americans gather this year to celebrate 250 years of independence, perhaps this is a good moment to ask ourselves a simple question. If you were creating a nation from scratch, would you give it only a wartime flag? Or would you also create a symbol for peace? Our forefathers appear to have answered that question long ago. They left us both, one flag for war and one flag for peace. Today, one is familiar. The other is largely forgotten. So perhaps the question isn't whether America had a peace flag. The historical record shows that she did. Perhaps the real question is this: why did we stop seeing it? And if peace was declared on the land, why didn't the peace flag remain? As we bring today's conversation to a close, I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts. Today, we explored a question that many Americans have never been encouraged to ask. If America has both a wartime flag and a peacetime flag, what happened to the peacetime flag? Along the way, we looked at the historical references, discussed the distinction between civilian and military symbols, and considered what it might mean if a nation continues to operate under symbols associated with war long after peace has been declared. But perhaps the most important thing we did today was simply pause long enough to ask questions. Questions are where learning begins. Questions are where self-governance begins. Questions are where remembering begins. The purpose of this podcast is not to tell you what to think. The purpose is to encourage you to look for yourself, to study, to research, to ask questions, to examine the historical record, and ultimately to decide for yourself what is true. As topics arise that we believe are important for those seeking to better understand their political status, their birthright inheritance, and what it means to live on the land and soil of Wyoming, we will continue releasing new episodes here on Wyoming on the Land. Our hope is that these conversations help illuminate a path for those who are searching for a deeper understanding of freedom, self-governance, responsibility, and community. If this episode resonated with you, it truly supports our work when you like the episode, leave a review, subscribe, and turn on notifications, and share it with someone who has been quietly asking these deeper questions about freedom, peace, self-governance, and the world we live in. If you would like to reach out to us, you can find us on Facebook at the Wyoming Assembly or visit us at wyomingontheland.com. And if you are on Wyoming, we would genuinely love to meet you face to face. Please join us for our second annual family picnic on August 15th in Casper, Wyoming at Adams Park. One of the most common things we hear from people who begin this journey is that they felt like they were alone. They thought they were the only ones asking these questions. They thought they were the only ones searching for something more. They were wrong. There are thousands of Americans across this country who are rediscovering their history, reclaiming their political status, rebuilding their local assemblies, and learning once again what it means to govern themselves and care for their communities. Here on Wyoming, that work is happening too. And there is a place for you, and we certainly welcome you. I'm Margaret Jacobson, the coordinator for the Wyoming Assembly, and this has been Wyoming on the Land podcast. Until next time, consider what it might mean for you to truly live in peace on the land and soil of this beautiful state of Wyoming. Your family is waiting for you. As we bring today's conversation to a close, I want to leave you with this thought. Whether this episode confirmed things you've long suspected, or whether it introduced ideas you've never encountered before, my hope is not that you walk away fearful. My hope is that you walk away curious. Because curiosity is where sovereignty begins. Not certainty, not dogma, not blind acceptance. Curiosity, the willingness to ask questions, the willingness to look a little deeper, the willingness to pause and notice when something doesn't quite add up. Today, we explored the possibility that America has not one flag, but two, a wartime flag and a peacetime flag. We explored the historical references to the American peace flag. We reflected on the fact that peace was declared on the land after the civil mercenary conflict between the states. And we asked a simple question. If peace was declared, where did the peace flag go? But underneath all of those questions lives a deeper one. How do we recognize the difference between being governed by fear and being guided by peace? Because ultimately that question doesn't only apply to nations. It applies to our bodies. It applies to our families. It applies to our health. It applies to every area of our lives. The same way many of us have been taught to hand authority over our bodies to experts, institutions, and systems, we have often been taught to hand our responsibility to understand the larger structures shaping our lives. Yet true sovereignty asks something different of us. It asks us to become conscious participants, to pay attention, to ask questions, to discern, to listen deeply, to think critically, and perhaps most importantly, to remain connected to the wisdom of our own hearts and wombs while we do it. If this episode resonated with you, it truly supports our work when you like the episode, leave us a review, subscribe, and turn on notifications on our channel, and share it with someone who has been quietly asking deeper questions about freedom, peace, self-governance, and the world we live in. Your sharing is how this medicine travels. You can find the Yin-care Podcast on YouTube and Rumble, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, and connect with us on Instagram at yin_care, as well as on TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, and Rumble at Yin-care. As America approaches her 250th birthday, I believe we are being invited into a profound season of remembering who we are, remembering how to govern ourselves, remembering how to trust our own discernment, remembering that peace is not merely the absence of conflict. Peace is a condition that lives within us. And then when enough people cultivate that inner condition, it begins to shape the world around them. So before you move on with your day, I invite you into a simple, gentle act of sovereignty. The next time you see an American flag flying, whether at school, a courthouse, a post office, or a 4th of July celebration, pause for a moment. Place your hand on your heart and take a breath and ask yourself, what does peace look like to me? What does self-governance look like to me? And what kind of world am I helping to create through the choices I make every day? Sit with whatever arises. No rushing, no forcing, just listening. Because listening is often where remembering begins. May you continue cultivating peace within your body. May you continue creating safety within your home. May you continue strengthening your capacity for discernment. And may you continue walking the path of embodied sovereignty, one conscious choice at a time. And please have a beautiful, happy, healthy 250th birthday of America. I'm Margaret Jacobson, the Mother Rising. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, honor yourself, celebrate your strength, and empower your transformation with your Yin-care. We cannot fail. We are willing and able to do this work physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. We have resolve and determination. We walk the talk and work every day to bring the du jour into reality. We have excellent tools to complete our work. We set realistic and achievable goals. We learn and research constantly. We have a timeline. We track our progress. We measure our strengths and weaknesses. We continually improve and revise accordingly. We conduct ourselves with peace and love. We keep the peace and uphold the public law. We report crime. We let our yes be yes and our no be no. We operate as fiduciaries under the prudent man standard. We aren't giving up. We aren't going away. We are not taking no for an answer.